Good morning, Pastor Andy here, and I get to bring you today's Common Thread devotional thought. And today we are in the 62nd Psalm of the book of Psalm, and this psalm is attributed to King David. And a little bit about David, if you don't know a lot about him, he was Israel's second king. He is regarded as Israel's greatest king ever, even through present day. King David is the bar. You strive to be like him. Now, he was not born into uh, the palace. In fact, he was a shepherd, and he had several older brothers that probably physically met the requirements for being a king better than he did. David was the runt of the family. He was the youngest, the scrawniest, the least of all of them. But he is the one that God chose, that God anointed, that God said, "You will be the next king of my people." And it was not a peaceful transition from Saul to David. Saul hated David. His heart grew hard towards him, and he wanted David to die so he could stay on his throne longer. He pursued David. He tried to kill him many, many times. There was plans and ambushes and all sorts of stuff. And every time God protected David because God had a promise to fulfill. And he did. And one day, David was installed as the king of Israel. And that is where David was when he wrote this. And we know that because of verse 4. It says, "They plan to topple me from my high position." That's a reference to his throne. He is saying, I am the king and people try to dethrone me. Now that brings us to today's reading, which is verses 5 through 12. And it begins, "Let all that I am wait quietly before God." In this phrase, David is not saying that I'm whispering my prayers. He's not saying I ask questions and then I wait for God to answer. There's not this conversational aspect to the relationship between David and God at this time. This means that he was completely silent before God, that his heart was laying prostrate and he was letting God speak to him. For my hope is in him. David knew, and he learned from mistakes in his life, that his way is not the best way. And that was a lesson he had to learn many times. But here he says, my hope is in him. My hope is in God, and I am laying quietly before him. And it's in this position of quietness, of just the searching of God and letting God speak to him. He writes the next 3 verses. He says, God is my rock, my salvation, my fortress. And he says, because of all of that, I will not be shaken. Now, David was a military man. His entire time on the throne was spent pretty much at war with other countries. Israel was growing its physical boundaries. It was establishing itself. And David is saying a lot of stuff right here in these verses. Where all that came from, he said, God is my rock. God is my fortress. God is my refuge. God is my defense. In David's time, in biblical history, ancient history, you wanted the high ground, or you wanted a high tower around your cities or at the corners of your walls, somewhere for you to have as a defensible position. From that high ground, from that high tower, you could see all around. You could see if there was enemies advancing on you, if they were trying to sneak up, if there was an ambush or anything like that. But David is saying, God is that high tower. God is watching over you. God can see all around. He knows what is coming. But David says, because of this, I will not be shaken. It doesn't say I will never know pain. He doesn't say I will never know loss. He says I will never be shaken because my hope is where? My hope is in God. And then he says in verse 7, my victory and honor come from God alone. Everything I have comes from God. My kingship, my throne, my crown, it's from God. The country that I have, the people that he has allowed me to rule over as king, they are from God. But he is saying, my victory, everything is God's. We need to learn from that. He goes on, he's my refuge, a rock where no enemy can be shaken. Remember, David just called God his high tower, that watchman that knows everything that's happening, that can see all around, that God is never taken by surprise. Oh, people, trust in him at all times. Trust in him at all times. God can see. He knows what's happening. He loves you so much that he sent Christ to dwell with us, to be the sacrifice for our sins. And because of all that, we can trust him with the details of our lives. King David literally trusted God with every breath that he took. He could have died many, many, many times. And God protected him physically. God protected his country. He provided for them. Now that doesn't mean King David never died. He did. He's very much dead. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. But David knew that God was sovereign. King David knew that God was his strength, his rock, his refuge, and he knew that he could trust in God. David didn't always understand what God was doing or know what God was going to do, but he trusted that God would do something. And he urges us in this next phrase, pour out your heart to him, for God is our refuge. Again and again in these 4 verses, 5, 6, 7, and 8, David is saying you can trust God, give to God, pray to God, let God speak to you, let God watch over you, let God be God. And then the passage takes a twist. You're like, all right, God is all these awesome things. And then in the next phrase, it's like, ooh. Because he says, common people are as worthless as a puff of wind. And if I never read anything in the Bible, but I read that one half of a sentence, I would think that this is a useless book. Because I just got called worthless. I am a common person. I am your everyday person. David is saying, oh, they're worthless, but that's not what he is saying. He goes on, because it doesn't stop there. And the powerful are not what they appear to be. We're like, all right, Pastor Andy, that's great. Woohoo! I'm worthless and powerful are not what they ought to be. I could have told you that. Well, these verses, many theologians think that David is not necessarily writing about you and me, but he's speaking now from personal experience, and he's kind of dogging on the officials in his palace or the high officers of his army, that they have again and again let him down. And so he is saying they are common people. They are not as good or as strong as they say they are. They fail. And he says if you weigh them on the scales, together they are lighter than a breath of air. I don't know. I've been on the scale recently, and I definitely weigh more than a breath of air. But again, David is not saying that we are worthless. He's not calling wealth bad. But what he is saying is, in contrast to God, who is mighty, who is sovereign, who is our rock, our refuge, our anchor, our high tower, we are everything down below. We need that rock. We need that high tower. We need God. And David gives us some warnings about extortion and stealing. Don't do it, it's bad. In David's time, wealth was seen as a gift from the divine, whether it was from God or whether it was from, if you believed in other gods. Your money, and if you had lots of it, was seen as a gift from God or those pantheon of gods. We know that the people in David's time that had money were not the most honest. Now, this isn't a blanket statement saying that anybody that is rich or that has money was dishonest, but no. I am saying that a lot of people got their wealth in ancient times by stealing or extortion. Extortion was when they would use their power, their influence to cause fear in someone else. So I felt compelled to give you my money, or my land, or my animals, or my slaves. That's extortion. Stealing is I'm just taking it because I want it. And people got rich that way. And it was seen as a gift from the divine. Was it right? Probably not. Because David says, and if your wealth increases, don't make it the center of your life. What was at the center of David's heart? We know that from verse 5, he says, I'm waiting quietly before the Lord. My hope is in him. You can't just say that and God not be the center of your life. If money is at the center of your life, you're going to get what you deserve. And it's going to get taken away somehow, at some point, by someone that's more important than you are, or through taxes, or someone else. But don't make wealth. Wealth is not a bad thing, but David is saying, do not make it the center of your life. And he goes on, he says, God has spoken plainly, and I have heard it many times. And in Scripture, when something is repeated, it means it's very important. And David, in this psalm, he's saying, what I'm about to tell you, God has told me many times. Maybe it's because David forgot what God had said and he didn't heed God's words or listen to them. But now he is saying, I have learned this and you need to learn it too. He says, power, O God, belongs to you. Unfailing love, O Lord, is yours. Power and unfailing love, power and mercy belong to you. Power and mercy are yours, Lord. David wants us to know who God is. He wants us to know that we can put our trust in God because of what God has done. Times are tough. We may be lonely. We may feel isolated. King David knows exactly what that's like. He lived in caves for a long time. He ran for his life, literally trying to be killed on a daily basis. He had to hide from assassins and armies and spies and all kinds of people that were sent by King Saul to kill him. If anyone would know what it is to fear for their life, I believe it would be King David. But he is saying, power and mercy are yours, O Lord. And he's saying that we can trust God because he is our rock, our strength, our high tower. He is watching over us. He is never taken by surprise. God is always there. Doesn't mean bad things can't or won't happen. But God is there. And if you put your trust in him, he will walk with you and walk you through those times. Today I would encourage us to do what David did in verse 5 and just be silent before God. And see what God says to you. See where God leads you. Get to know God. Let God speak to you. I hope you have a wonderful day that is full of God's blessings, where you just see Him everywhere. God bless you.